Proverbs 31 is a really good chapter. A lot of good information in there. But it's interesting that as I talk to Christian women, especially women who've been Christians for quite a long time, Proverbs 31 can sometimes be as much a discouragement as an encouragement to women. You have kind of this dynamo that's presented in Proverbs 31, a woman who is respected by all, a woman who has earned her place, who works hard, who works diligently, who is pleasing, who is exciting. She's a vibrant and vivacious woman who has put her hands to a great diversity of tasks. And I think that sometimes people can read Proverbs 31 and see that as an almost unattainable expectation that's been set. In a certain way, the same thing could be said maybe from a man's perspective of the qualifications to be an elder, a leader in the church. We might look at the qualifications for an elder and think, well, I could never achieve that. That would never be me. I don't think I could ever be that honest, that honorable, that free from the love of money or corruption. I don't think that that is a goal or a standard that I could ever attain to either. So I guess in your own life, whether you're a man or a woman, young, old, whatever your situation is, do you sometimes feel like there is an expectation for you to be something more than you think you can be? A lot of times that comes about because of the things that we're facing right now. Because of a grief that we're facing, because of a trial, because of suffering. We look at our own lives and we think, I could never be that because I'm too distracted. I'm too small. I'm too in pain right now to ever become that expectation. To ever be that person that people think that I should be. That people think that I ought to be. One writer put it really well when describing this problem in an article very similar to the title of our lesson called When You're Living Psalm 31 Instead of Proverbs 31. Joy Allman said, if you are a woman and have been part of the church for any length of time, chances are good that you have studied Proverbs 31, alone or with a group of other women. Some of us have heard it so much that we've become jaded or noticed that people have just cliched it. Others, however, feel discouraged by Proverbs 31 because we don't measure up to it, or we don't feel as though we have the favor of the Proverbs 31 woman. That can be a real danger for people and a real discouragement. When a text is supposed to be encouraging, when a text is supposed to set us up not for failure or an expectation of failure, but an expectation of achievement, that's somebody I can be, that's somebody I should strive to emulate, really it's very dangerous for us then. And there are a lot of conditions in life that make us feel this way. Now, a lot of things we're going to talk about today, I'll tell you in advance, are going to be directed more at the women in our lives, the women in this congregation or those who are listening online later. This is going to be a woman-centric conversation we're going to have today. Not because I'm any kind of expert on women, and Rebecca can tell you I'm far from an expert on her, but because I think it's something that a lot of women face. And although a lot of lessons are going to be directed more at women and the things that they face, certainly I don't think anybody's going to walk away from this lesson feeling like there's nothing to learn, no application for you. Whether you're a man or a woman, again, young or old, rich or poor, I think that there's great lessons that you take away from the expectation in Proverbs 31, as well as the sometimes reality of Psalm 31, which is our text for the day. The Psalm 31 woman, so to speak, looks very, very different from the Proverbs 31 woman, where the Proverbs 31 woman sets about her work with great eagerness, where she's a very vibrant person who seems to always be at the top of her game in both public and private settings. The Psalm 31 woman is stricken with grief. She feels alone and isolated, alienated. She feels that she is against the world and the world is against her, and she is failing under that weight. Notice in our text in Psalm 31 and verse 9. Psalm 31, beginning in verse 9. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted away from grief, my soul and my body also. For my life is spent with sorrow, my years with sighing. My strength has failed me because of my iniquity, and my body has wasted away. Because of all my adversaries, I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. I am forgotten as a dead man, out of mind. I'm like a broken vessel. For I have heard the slander of many. Terror is on every side. While they took counsel together against me, they schemed to take away my life. And we'll notice some other things out of Psalm 31 later in the lesson, but for now, that's where our focus is going to be. In this lesson, what I want to do is look at five truths to take away from Psalm 31. 5 things that we need to remember, that if we're facing a Psalm 31 season of life, and we all do, it's peaks and valleys for everybody. That's just reality. Things might be going really well for you right now, but they won't last forever. Things might be going really bad for you right now, but that won't last forever as well. It's all peaks and valleys with us. So if you are going through that Psalm 31 season of life, here are 5 truths to remember as we move forward. The first one is this, that your sorrow can turn into joy. And you notice I said joy, not necessarily happiness. Happiness is fleeting. Happiness can be very superficial. Happiness is kind of the fluff of life. Joy has more meat to it than that. Your sorrow can turn into joy. Even in the midst of trials, even as you're experiencing the grief and the suffering, you can nevertheless have joy to depend on. Now, our writer Joy Almond, she goes on to say in this same article, a woman who is living, Psalm 31 verse 9, is under deep emotional stress. Not only is she emotionally spent, but her eyes are worn out from shedding so many tears. And this doesn't sound like the silent tears that gently roll down your cheek. Those are beautiful tears. Those are the pretty kinds of tears when you just got a single tear coming down the side of your face. No, Joy says this sounds like what some of us call the ugly cry, or what I like to call the Tobey Maguire from Spider-Man cry. That's the ugly cry. We all know the ugly cry. Kids do the ugly cry. Adults look even worse when they do the ugly cry. But joking aside, that is the Psalm 31 person, isn't it? This is a person who has said, I am in distress. My eye is wasted away from grief. My soul and my body also. My life is spent with sorrow. I don't think she's saying I spend my time in sorrow. I think she's saying my life is spent. It's exhausted. My energy is taken up with sorrow. Have you ever cried so hard that you could say the same thing, that my eyes have wasted away? Have you ever been in such sorrow that your stomach hurts, that your body is aching? Then we compare that to Proverbs 31. What does it say in Proverbs 31 and verse 25? It says that the woman of Proverbs 31, she laughs at the days to come. She's excited about the future. She laughs at the prospect of tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. But no, not Psalm 31. Psalm 31 is not looking forward to tomorrow. She's not laughing at anything right now. She is brought down with sorrow, broken by sorrow. She has nothing to laugh about. Now, of course, it never says in Proverbs 31 that the worthy woman of that chapter is not without concern. But I think when you learn something there, you learn something that since she laughs at the days to come, it means that she's secure in knowing who holds the future. She's secure in knowing that somebody is in control of things, somebody who is beyond her. I know it seems like those are two conflicting ideas, that a person can be wasted away with sorrow, their eyes spent, their body spent, exhausted, and yet still looking forward to the future. Maybe you don't feel like you have anything to look forward to in life. That's reasonable. A lot of people go through that kind of time. A lot of people have that season, that period of life where they don't feel like any day offers them anything. What can tomorrow possibly bring to me? But I think that's where we work toward going from the Psalm 31 state to the Proverbs 31 state. You can't ever have it without the sorrow. You ever think about that? You can't ever have the joy without the sorrow. What is joy without sorrow? What is relief without pain? They don't exist. I would assert that. Joy doesn't exist without suffering. We wouldn't understand what joy is without suffering. We would not appreciate it. We wouldn't have the perspective to understand it in any way. Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 31. And in Jeremiah 31, notice with me, if you will, a set of verses here that I think explain what we're trying to talk about. In Jeremiah 31, beginning in verse 10, notice here, in Jeremiah 31, beginning in verse 10, "Hear the word of the Lord, O nations. Declare in the coastlands afar off and say, He who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd and keep him as a shepherd who keeps his flock. For the Lord has ransomed Jacob and redeemed him from the hand of him who was stronger than he." Verse 12. "They shall come and shout for joy on the heights of Zion. They shall be radiant over the bounty of the Lord, over the grain and the new wine, the oil, over the young of the flock and the herd. And their life shall be like a watered garden, and they shall never languish again." Verse 13. "Then the virgin shall rejoice in the dance, and the young men and the old together. For I will turn their mourning into joy, and will comfort them and give them joy for their sorrow. I will fill the soul of the priest with abundance, and my people will be satisfied with my goodness, says the Lord. I will turn their mourning into joy." How? Part of it's perspective. I think that's a really big part of it. Understanding their history. If you're not familiar with where we are in their history, the people of Israel, now reduced to just the tribe of Judah essentially, are facing great trial and a temptation to give up hope in God. They have enemies on all sides, Babylon being the greatest specter on the horizon, a constant specter of danger that hovers over them. God has now said, Babylon will destroy you because of your sins. Your transgressions have led to this. Because of your idolatry, because of your apostasy and your failure to keep me in the forefront, now you will suffer the consequences at the hands of the Babylonians. But don't worry. As God says here in Jeremiah 31 and many other places, don't worry. That is a refining fire. You will come out the other end of that tribulation better people than when you started. And it is true. History does show that after the Babylonian captivity, the Jews never again flirted with idolatry. Not once. Up until that point, it seemed like it was idolatry every other generation. But after the captivity, they never again touched idolatry. They became a better people. Just read Ezra and Nehemiah and see the sobriety of spirit that those people have. They returned to Jerusalem in appreciation. They had never looked on their home city with those eyes. They had never longed for temple worship like they did when the temple was burned to the ground. They never knew what it was like to practice a Passover until they practiced a Passover once again in their homeland. They didn't understand joy until they understood sorrow first. They could not have found joy if they had not walked through the land of sorrow first. Friends, your sorrow will be turned to joy because God is in control and He knows where you're going. God has enough perspective to show you something along the way. Now, we might not like it, and it might be a very, very hard concept for us to accept. But God knows how things turn out. Now, that doesn't mean He's predestined or that He's set in stone, that it can only turn out a certain way. But God sees all the angles. He sees all the options, all the paths. God knows where you're going. And when you choose door number 1 or door number 2, when you choose this way or that way, He knows where that path leads. Trust Him then. Give Him a little bit of credit here. He knows that we need to experience pain in this life. He knows that there's a great reward that's waiting for us if we can endure the pain that's set before us. And if you keep on reading in Psalm 31, by the way, which we will, the writer of Psalm 31 learned that lesson. Maybe the hard way, but the writer of Psalm 31 did learn that lesson. The next truth that I would have you understand from Psalm 31, if you're going through a phase in your life like that, is this, that it's not just about redemption. It's about restoration. It's not just about having your sins forgiven and released from the guilt. It's about being restored and built up into something new, something bigger than what you were before. The suffering the psalmist describes in Psalm 31 goes beyond the crying and the emotional pain. The emotional pain, the writer says, has manifested itself into physical pain. He hurts so bad that it feels it in his body. The way I always thought of it is this. Have you ever felt small? Not necessarily in your height or your weight or something. Have you ever been so weighed down with something that you actually feel a little smaller than you did before? That's the only way I can describe it. Maybe it's not something you've ever experienced or felt, but have you ever just felt small? Because of sin, because of guilt, because of problems in life, have you just felt small? The writer of Psalm 31 feels small right now. That writer feels small, inadequate, broken down. Feeling small is a real condition that a lot of people face. Are you weakened to the point that even simple things become burdensome? Think of this. And let's bring it home, okay? Let's bring it home. Are you so weakened? Are you in such a Psalm 31 state that just getting dressed in the morning is an accomplishment? Now, for a lot of people, we might think, what's the big deal, getting dressed? The reality is there are people who are so hurt right now that just getting dressed is an accomplishment. Do you feel so broken down by life that just dragging the kids to a grocery store is like crossing the Andes Mountains, barefoot? Are you so weighed down that just going to worship is almost too much of a burden to handle? We get the kids all dressed, barely get them in the car on time, got to drive all the way to church, and then they're tugging at my hair and poking at me and pestering me, and they got to go potty. They always have to go potty, don't they? They're always needing to go potty. What's funny is when you ask kids, do you have to go potty? No. Kids never have to go potty until you're sitting in church or until you're on the freeway halfway between point A and point B. They never need to go potty until then. But does just going to worship wear you out? This Psalm 31 condition makes it so that even the simplest of tasks become an immense burden. And I think that a lot of us feel that way sometimes. And again, if you're in a Psalm 31 season of life, physically, remember this. God knows, and He not only knows, but like I said, He restores. He restores. Go to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 10. Notice, if you will, in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 10, this is a very powerful verse. This is one that, of any verse that you could read about restoration, this one hits the nail on the head, I think, most of all. He says in 1 Peter 5 and verse 10, in the English Standard Version, "And after you have suffered for a little while," really, that's all of us, after you've suffered for a little while. No matter how much we suffer in this life compared to eternity, it's a little while. If you suffer for 75 years, you've only suffered for a little while compared to the eternal existence that you're going to enjoy with God. But after you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to His eternal glory in Christ, will Himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Think of it this way, friends. In this context, in 1 Peter chapter 5, who was Peter writing to? Was he writing to people who had just lost their jobs because of a bad economy? Was he writing to people who were having a hard time with osteoporosis or whatever? I know it's not a real thing, but we have so many things that we diagnose ourselves with. Is he talking to people? Is he talking to people with a food allergy? Is he talking to people who can't figure out what they want to wear in the morning because they have a closet full of clothes and can't decide? No, he's talking to people who are being killed because of their faith. He's talking to people who are being alienated from society because of the way they stand up for Christ. And I don't want to make people feel bad about their sorrows or anything. But really, is there anything that we experience now that we can look at the first century and go, yeah, they got nothing on me? Not really. And yet Peter says to this audience in the first century, the God of all grace, after you've suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, He will restore you. He'll confirm you. He'll strengthen you. He'll establish you. He will take you and make you stronger than you were before. One of our favorite things to do is to watch HGTV. We love that channel. Almost anything. Just turn on HGTV, just let it run 24 hours a day. Because we're horrible people and we watch a lot of TV apparently. But you ever see it on one of those shows where they take a house that's too small, too ugly, little tiny kitchen, cockroaches in the wall, old electrical wiring, mold in the basement. They pour all the money into it. They put all the work into it. They go through the valley of sorrows. And at the end of it, that house has been restored. More often than not, that house looks even better than it probably did when it was first built. Stronger than when it was first built. Better equipped. They always make the kitchens bigger, don't they? They always take that original kitchen, make it bigger. Bigger bathrooms, bigger closets. He was saying, you only had 2,000 square feet to start with. How is it possible that you've taken the same amount of square footage and made a bigger closet and a bigger kitchen and a bigger bathroom? Where did all the extra space come from? God will take your life. He will take your life broken down and He will restore it also. He will find space in your house to expand your life. He will strengthen you in ways that you didn't think that your frame was possible to handle. He'll make you into a person that's better than you ever could have imagined yourself to be. But that's not all. God is the owner of my reputation also. I think we forget about that sometimes, that there is more at stake than just what I think of myself, and there's more at stake than just what other people think of me. God is the owner of my reputation. For those of us who feel like we don't measure up to the expectation of the Proverbs 31 woman or the elder qualifications in the New Testament, if we don't feel like we measure up to the expectations of the people around us, try being a preacher sometime. Try being a preacher's wife sometime. And if you don't feel like you measure up to other people's expectations, verse 23 of Proverbs 31 can be particularly daunting. Go to Proverbs 31, look at verse 23. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She is expected to be the dynamo along with her husband. Sometimes, especially with the presence of social media in our lives, the life of a woman can sometimes just revert back to middle school. Do you ever feel like you're back in middle school? Do you ever feel like as you conduct yourself as an adult that you're just back in middle school playing the same games and the same politics that you did when you were 12 years old? What was she wearing today? Oh no, she didn't, right? You ever feel like you're just back in middle school? Adults can be babies. Adults can be real babies. I don't expect anything more from my toddlers. I really don't. Now, they frustrate me sometimes. That's okay. That's your compound word for the day, by the way. English major. Frustrate. Write it down. They frustrate me sometimes, but I don't expect a whole lot more from my toddlers. But when adults act like babies, maybe I shouldn't be so surprised. Life can just feel like a popularity contest sometimes. You just don't measure up. And anyone who feels socially inferior can certainly relate to Psalm 31, can't they? Remember in Psalm 31, back in verses 11 through 13, because of my enemies, I am the utter contempt of my neighbors. I am the object of dread to my closest friends. Those who see me on the street flee from me. I'm forgotten as a dead man. I've become like a broken vessel or broken pottery. The Psalm 31 woman has a feeling of uselessness. Like there's nothing that she can do. Like she is a broken piece of pottery. Can't hold water. Oh, the feeling of uselessness is awful. When you feel like you're not changing anybody, when you're not affecting anybody, that's the worst feeling in the world. I've become like broken pottery. I hear them whispering terror on every side. They conspire against me. They plot to take my life. The Psalm 31 woman has a sense that others are against her and that others are eager to see her downfall. The Psalm 31 woman looks at life and she feels like she is alone in her fight against sadness and loneliness. Alone in her fight to raise her kids. Alone in her fight to keep her husband from sexual impurity. The Psalm 31 woman feels like she is alone in the world and others are just waiting in the wings to see her fail. That is the Psalm 31 woman. One of the key stressors in the lives of most women, most people in general, I would say, is the felt obligation to please everybody around them. But it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks of you. It really doesn't. Easy to say, I know, harder to accept. But God is the owner of your reputation. He is the only one whose opinion should matter. Even when your house crumbles, God is the constant. The Proverbs 31 woman sounds like Miss Popular, doesn't she? Everybody respects her. Everybody loves her. And especially to those who struggle with their relationships, it's hard to look at the Proverbs 31 woman and see anything but an impossible standard. Maybe you're unlike the Proverbs 31 woman. Maybe your husband is not respectable. Maybe he doesn't treat you well. Maybe he doesn't go to church with you. Maybe he doesn't even know or love God. And maybe you feel like those realities reflect negatively on you. Though we need to be encouraged. We need to be encouraged because there's actually good news in the verses that immediately follow. Go back to Psalm 31, our text, and notice here, right after the text that we finished reading, go to verses 14 and 15, and notice here, but as for me, I like there's an independence there. As for me, you know what? If everybody else around me fails, if the whole world around me crumbles, if my family life falls apart, my kids are a spiritual wreck, my husband is an abuser, if everything else falls apart around me, as for me, I will trust in the Lord. I say, Thou art my God. My times are in your hand. I've left it up to you. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and from those who persecute me. Though the whole world may fall apart around me, I am leaving it up to you. You are the one who holds me. We can't control what anybody else does. You can't control what your spouse does or what your spouse believes or what your spouse practices. You can't control it. You can't force your children to be faithful to God. You hope and you pray that they will be, and you do the best you can to teach. But as for me, the only one I can control is me. The only soul that I can control is mine. It's hard for us to accept this because we all love our families. We love the relationships. We love the acceptance, the almost unconditional acceptance that comes with being part of a family. Your family loves you for you because you can't stop being family. Your brother is always going to be your brother. No matter how much of a slob he is, Your brother is always physically your brother. Your mom is always your mom. That's the reality. And you love the acceptance that comes with being part of a family. But have you chosen acceptance with your family over acceptance by God? Because even Jesus himself said, if you love father or mother or brother or sister or even husband or wife more than me, you're not worthy of me. And he's not saying stop loving your family. But he says in comparison to the love you should have for God, you should almost even hate your family. In comparison to your love for God. So even if your whole family crumbles, even if your whole life falls apart, or even if you have the Brady Bunch living in your house, it's not about them. It is about, but as for me, I trust in the Lord. Remember to observe the blessings in other people's lives. Go to verses 19 and 20. Go to verses 19 and 20 of Psalm 31. How abundant are the good things that you've stored up for those who fear you, that you bestow in the sight of all on those who take refuge in you. In the shelter of your presence, you hide them from all human intrigues. You keep them safe in your dwelling from accusing tongues. And this is a person who wasn't really going through this right now. Isn't that interesting? That the person writing Psalm 31 is currently being persecuted, and yet he's here going, yes, but you take care of those who love you. I'm going through persecution. I'm crushed. I'm broken down. I'm weighed down. But you take care of those who love you. Well, how can that be? A lot of it has to do with this. We all go through those cycles. Like I said earlier, peaks and valleys, good times and bad times. Maybe instead of being so focused on yourself, on the pain that you're feeling right now, instead of judging God because of what you're feeling right now, why don't you look around at the good things that happen all around you? Maybe things aren't happening for you at the moment. Maybe you're not healthy at the moment. Maybe your relationships are broken at the moment. Maybe now is a Psalm 31 phase of your life. Right now. But does that mean everybody's going through Psalm 31? Does that mean everybody's miserable? Losing a child is hard. Crushing a miscarriage will break a person spiritually and emotionally. And a miscarriage can break a family if that family's not careful. And I think it's very easy for us to look at the problems that we have in our lives. A miscarriage, a lost job or a lost opportunity, a loved one who's passed away, perhaps even tragically. And we forget that for every miscarriage or lost job or loved one who passes away, there are countless other babies being born, and people working hard, and loved ones who are being cured of their illnesses. It's almost like when you stop looking down at your own problems, when you stop looking into a hat filled with your problems and lift your head up and start observing the world around you, you realize, like the person of Psalm 31 says, you know, actually, God does take care of His people. Maybe at the moment I'm going through a trial, but the majority, the rule of thumb, the overall impression that you have of God in His providential care, it's not that He hates us, but that He loves us dearly. And it's all about taking your face out of your own problems and looking around at all the good things happening to other people in the world. You can't rejoice in your sufferings, I get that. But maybe you can take some comfort in observing the blessings of other people. The last point that we'll make this morning is this. I said in my alarm. Go back to Psalm 31 and notice here, beginning in verse 22. So let's start in verse 22. As for me, I said in my alarm, I am cut off from before thine eyes. Nevertheless, thou didst hear the voice of my supplications when I cried to thee. I said in my alarm. That's an interesting phrase. I said in my alarm. There's a lot of conclusions that we come to during times of grief and trial. that are wrong conclusions. Now, you're not a bad person for coming to those conclusions, but the reality is that grief and trial, that suffering sometimes leads us to some very wrong conclusions. Suffering puts blinders on us, so we don't see the whole picture. We don't see the whole story. Suffering and grief causes us to think emotionally rather than rationally. It causes us to come to conclusions that we want to hear and want to feel and want to know rather than what can actually be known logically, rationally, with our minds when we put things to the test of Scripture. That's what grief does. And the writer of Psalm 31 says, I said in my alarm, when I panicked, when I was hurting, when I was in a moment of stress, this was the conclusion that I came to. What did he say? I am cut off before thine eyes. Was that true, though? In his alarm, he came to an incorrect conclusion about God. In my alarm, I said, I'm cut off before thine eyes. God doesn't care about me. God doesn't see me. God doesn't know. And God is not here to help. And yet he says, nevertheless, in my alarm, I came to a wrong conclusion about life and God. I panicked. Nevertheless, think of it this way. Let nevertheless into your life. Compare what you know with what you feel and stay faithful to a God who dwells in the nevertheless. God doesn't dwell in the conclusions that we come to in our panic. God dwells in the nevertheless. Let nevertheless into your life, like the writer of Psalm 31 did. Our response to sorrow should never be to pull away, but to cry to Thee. Thou didst hear the voice of my supplications. When? When I cried to Thee. Don't expect God to hear you if you're not going to cry to Him. Where is God when I'm suffering? Where is your prayer when you're suffering? How come God doesn't hear me when I'm going through this? Because you're not talking to Him. God heard my supplication. You heard the voice of my crying. When? When I cried to Thee. And yet, the automatic response that a lot of people tend to have when they're facing suffering is to pull away. We want to pull away. When we're facing suffering, we want to say, I don't want to believe in God anymore. I don't want to go to church anymore. I don't want to be around Christians anymore. I don't want to pray. I don't want to study. I don't want to have spiritual devotion of any kind. I want to avoid it. I want to pull back from God and avoid God. But Psalm 31 says the only way that God's ever going to hear you is if you do cry to Him. Don't pull away. Don't run away. Don't avoid Him. You'll never come to the right conclusion if you do. You'll never come to the right conclusion if you do. Proverbs 31 is a great and daunting expectation, isn't it? There's a lot of other things in the Bible that are pretty daunting sometimes. Expectations that are placed upon us, not by other people, but by God. Rather than wilting under the pressures of life, see those expectations as an opportunity to strive for something bigger. The writer of Psalm 31 could very easily have ended at verse 13 and said, this is my life, this is how it's supposed to be, I'm miserable, I hate everything, people hate me, and I'm just going to hide. I'm going to hide from responsibilities, I'm going to hide from God, I'm going to hide from the truth of God's love and mercy and ultimate compassion for me. But the writer of Psalm 31 did not stop at verse 13. He pressed on. He pressed on because he knew that at the end of the valley of the shadow of death, there was life. And there was a reward that goes far beyond wealth, youth, health, and even family. That is the rich reward of knowing God intimately for all eternity. Whatever need you might have, I encourage you to please let that need be known while together we stand and sing.